Hello and welcome to The Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of The Gaggle, Peter Lavelle, host of RT's talk show Crosstalk. Well, amidst all the chaos and bitter fighting in Washington, one event took place the other day, a very important event that attracted very little media attention. And it's very significant. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced a major reversal of US policy towards China. He said that the restrictions that the United States had imposed on itself with regard to Taiwan, namely various diplomatic governmental relations between the United States government and the government of in Taipei, will now be rescinded, and that there will be normal relations among diplomats and government officials. He did not say, that's a very important proviso, he did not say that the United States would now recognize Taiwan as an independent state. He merely said that restrictions will now be lifted, and so the diplomats are free to visit Taiwan and have negotiations and so on with the Taiwan officials. Taiwan, of course, is ecstatic about this change of policy. The Chinese are furious. And it's a very interesting question as to what happens now. Does the Biden administration continue with this policy, or would they try to reverse it? Reversal may be a little hard to do because it would certainly engender great unpopularity for Biden at home. But on the other hand, if he continues with it, then some kind of a conflict with China is quite likely if, and this is quite a distinct possibility, Taiwan at some point in the next couple of years decides to go and declare independence, because China has always said that's a red line for China. It would go to war under those circumstances. And then the question is, what does the United States do? All right, Peter, what's your take?
Well, first of all, everybody has to know the conditions for the United States and China to have exchanged diplomatic missions and recognize each other as sovereign states is that the United States was required not to have high-level contact with Taiwan. That was part of the deal. The US is breaking that deal, okay? That was the condition, one of the many conditions that the United States and China established diplomatic relations. And of course, the think tanks and the deep state and the swamp, or whatever you want to say, they know that this is a extreme red line for the Chinese, because the Chinese recognize Taiwan as part of China, like Hong Kong. And any kind of outside meddling in Taiwan from their perspective is meddling in the internal affairs of China's domestic politics. So the United States is breaking its word, number one here. And of course, the way you phrased it at the end, this is creating a trap for Biden intentionally. And of course, who best to do it than Mike Pompeo? As he's going out the door, he kicks a hornet's nest for the next administration. Now, for me, Biden or Trump or whoever, I'm looking at the relative positioning of the United States vis-a-vis China, and this is a deadly path to go down to. The Chinese are very serious about this. They've made it very, very clear. And of course, this will embolden politicians in Taipei to go down, possibly go down the path of independence. And Beijing has made it very, very, very clear. This is a cause for war. I mean, this is like Beijing sending a high-level diplomatic mission to Hawaii, okay? and having separate negotiations where Hawaii would have a separate foreign policy from the rest of the country. And if you look at it that way, then you can see how sensitive it is here. So this is just an intentional way to increase tensions where there are already increased tensions here. And you're absolutely right. It would be it'll make it difficult for Biden to walk away from it, even though it's not his policy, because of all the get tough with China rhetoric going all through the United States right now. When America's biggest security threat isn't China, it's its own political elite. That is the biggest danger to the American people.
Right. No, that's exactly right. And one really has to think about China's policy. Now, China like any other country, guards its sovereignty very jealously. But it has also been quite moderate in its policy toward Taiwan and toward Hong Kong. It waited patiently until the lease on that little rock ran out, and then it reclaimed its sovereignty over Hong Kong. It more or less adhered to the agreement about one nation, two systems. And there's no question Taiwan has gone its own way. I mean, it does have a separate identity of its own. It does have a political system very different from that of mainland China. And in many ways, it is de facto a different country. China has kind of basically tolerated this. So in such circumstances, you need to maintain a delicate balance. So China says, yeah, okay, you do have a distinct identity of its own. You are kind of de facto independent, but you are still part of China. And that is something very important to us. And therefore, any attempt for you to make this a kind of a legal thing, that you are an independent state, that you are not a part of China, that is a cause for war, because that is a clear violation of our sovereignty. So this is a very serious situation. And it really was reckless of Pompeo to just do this on the way out.
It's extremely reckless. So let's put it into context. What does this mean? Okay, of course, everything you said. Taiwan is very different. Actually, the origins of the current government in Taiwan is at the end of the civil war in China, where Mao Zedong and his communists achieved victory. You had the government before flee to what was called Formosa, and established a government there. And for decades, it was still recognized as the legal entity for China. Okay, and then when the United States and China started to parlay to establish diplomatic relations, one of the things the Chinese said, he said, you got to break relations with this, and all your allies have to as well. And almost everybody has, virtually everyone has. Okay. But now, for the average person in Des Moines, I'm going to tell you what this means. So if Taipei and Beijing get into a squabble, we're going to be pulled into it, okay? This is an unforced error, because George is absolutely right. For decades, there's been no invasion of Taiwan. The Chinese have been waiting it out because of trade and even cultural exchanges. I mean, they're Chinese, for goodness sake. I mean, they may have a different differences on the margins because they are apart and have been apart for quite a few decades. But nonetheless, this is an internal affair among Chinese, okay? And the United States is perilously putting itself into a position where it's going to have to choose to go to possibly get into a military conflict over what? Taiwan? How is that in the American national interest? Please explain to everyone, to me. And one thing I get so sick and tired of hearing, George, the Chinese want to control the sea lanes, okay, and deny other countries. China is dependent on trade. It's the country that wants to keep the sea lanes open more than anyone else. Okay, and just for out of self-interest, that it has every reason to keep the sea lanes open. See, every single argument they have is flawed. Okay, the thing is that the Chinese do not want hegemony. What the threat to Chinese security is the Americans demanding that it maintain global hegemony. That's where the conflict comes from. It's not China doesn't pose a direct threat to the United States whatsoever. And this move here is that it cuts out any reason for the government in Taiwan and the government in Beijing to sit down and parlay and work out their differences. This is a reason not to do something. That is the worst type of diplomacy.
Yes, that's right. Because it is quite likely that there will be forces within Taiwan that will now push for some form of independence. And that indeed will be reckless, because almost certainly China would then impose a blockade on Taiwan. And a blockade is a warlike act, and the United States will therefore be under some pressure.
And enforce it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a serious business. What's interesting, of course, is that this major change of policy does not cause any rethinking in Washington. I mean, we have Nancy Pelosi making all her inane pronouncements over the weekend, the gas bags on Capitol Hill, talking their utter nonsense. This week we're going to have a nonsense of an impeachment in the House of Representatives. And here is something, a major change of policy, huge implications for the United States. And America's political class just sort of, what the hell's going on here? Let's just keep talking about Trump. And this is a kind of an interesting thing, what we've had during the Trump years. He has embarked on quite drastic reversals of U.S. policy of decades standing. I mean, not just the one on China, but for instance, on a recognition of settlement building on Israeli occupied lands. A policy of very long standing since the 1967 war. Trump just simply reversed it, but perhaps very little criticism. I mean, he just
Golan Heights.
Yeah. Sorry, what was that?
Golan Heights.
Yeah, exactly. Recognition of the Golan Heights annexation. And again, so it's a strange kind of thing that the political class, which should criticize Trump for these unilateral decisions, is asleep at the switch, and instead looking for completely bogus issues, such as, he's inciting a riot, and absolute nonsense. There is a real sense of total frivolity prevailing in Washington.
There's so much to criticize Trump for. They never criticize him for the right reasons. It's for the entire administration. Just one more thing about the issue with Taiwan is that, again, I brought up the example of what a person in Des Moines should make up all of this here. Well, what about somebody in Sydney or Tokyo or Manila? Okay, the tripwire, you're creating a tripwire, and the United States wants to create this alliance system like a NATO for the Pacific, and then you pull in people that don't have a beef with China about Taiwan. It's like their issue. It's one country. I mean, why are you pulling us into this? See, this is why alliances of this nature are inherently dangerous, because it takes one bad actor, one bad move, and then all of a sudden you have August 1914 all over again. And it's like, how'd that happen?
No, that's
okay, true. This is why it's so dangerous to do. And it's nonsensical, and it doesn't achieve anything positive.
No, that's it. And in fact, what you've had is a delicate balance, which was kind of surprising that they managed to achieve. And remember, following Nixon's visit to China in 1972, the United States still did not establish diplomatic relations with China until 1979. So several years. And then it maintained this delicate balance that, Taiwan is no longer officially the Chinese government, but we will still maintain trading relations with Taiwan. We will still sell arms to Taiwan. And this very delicate balance has been maintained. Now that's gone. And really, it's put the United States into a very serious confrontation with China.
Yeah, it just adds another layer of tensions that don't need to be there. I mean, you need to think about all of this counterintuitively. With a simmering conflict with China possibly on the horizon, a smart diplomat, if you want to use diplomacy, would say, "Hey, why don't we just resolve this whole thing with Taiwan? It's just take that off the table. Okay, we're not going to bother you about Hong Kong. Okay, and then you add on trade agreements and dumping, anti-dumping things, and then work with the currency. I mean, start working at the edges and work in to lower tensions. This is the opposite. It's just like poking somebody in the eye. Okay.
Well, that's right, and it sort of eliminates from the discussion on areas where the United States does have, I think, legitimate grievances. I mean, when it comes to trade, when it comes to currency, when it comes to COVID. I mean, I think America has a very strong case. The rest of the whole world has a very strong case that we don't know enough about the origins of COVID, what the Chinese knew, what the Chinese know now, and how are we going to stop this ever happening again. Chinese have been very uncooperative. And here, I think the United States has a very strong case to bring against China. But Taiwan and Hong Kong are not, those aren't strong cases. Those are internal Chinese affairs, and the Chinese will just brush them aside.
That is such an excellent point, George, because up until the beginning of last year, when COVID hit, most people didn't have an inkling what a pandemic means. I mean, we haven't had a major pandemic in 100 years, but everyone should keep in mind, pandemics are actually quite common in history. Okay, quite common. And China being the most populous country in the world and America's equal economically, I mean, I think it's pretty good. It would be a pretty good idea if Washington and Beijing kept that channel open, and in coordinating possible future events. But what happens if COVID it morphs into something much more lethal, which in some cases it has become more lethal. In the UK, for example, a case has been found in the United States and other places. So, I mean, is this really the time you want to be slamming the door in someone's face? Because that's essentially what it is, okay? And, before those watching this thing, George and I are kowtowing to China. No, we're not. I just don't see a reason to escalate a potential conflict. I say keep de-escalating and let the Taipei government and the Beijing government work out their differences. It'll be far more effective because if you have this huge military partner, ally across the ocean that's going to say, we got your back, then there's no reason to negotiate, okay? And then that stops everything.
Right. No, that's exactly right. I mean, if there are disputes between the United States and China, those are the disputes that have to be addressed, and you have to address them in a way in which both the United States and China accept that these are common disputes among us, unless we can sit down and argue them out. When you raise internal affairs, then you're just causing antagonism because the Chinese don't recognize your right to pontificate about what goes on inside China. Yet the United States continues to do this when it brings up the Uyghurs, when it brings up Hong Kong, when it brings up Taiwan. It's quite pointless. It's an absolute waste of time and just causes bad feeling continually to bring them up rather than focusing on issues that are genuinely in contention.
And people need to keep in mind, again, Western media doesn't serve any kind of real public service anymore. Even into the 20th century, parts of China were colonized by outside forces. Okay, and typical American or someone in Western, oh, it's a long time ago. Not for the Chinese. Okay, that was not long ago. Okay, and it was a humiliation. And when they see someone like Mike Pompeo meddling in the internal affairs of Taiwan, this is what they say. This is the kind of behavior that we've seen from the West before. Okay, it's none of their business.
Right.
And I want to make it clear, the recognition, the mutual recognition of the United States and China for diplomatic affairs, that was one of the key foundations, is that you do not have any high-level official contact with Taiwan. Okay, that's in it.
No, that's exactly right. And again, in China, as in Russia, the Civil War was quite recent. The Civil War in China ended in 1949, a civil war in which the United States played a very active role, incidentally. Just again, in Russia, civil war ended about 100 years ago, 1921. So you're talking about countries which, that's fairly recent. That's not that long ago. I mean, America is still rehashing the issues of its civil war, and that ended a long time ago. So don't just think and say, oh, well, that's a long time ago. For many countries, yeah, that's fairly recent. And we don't want to go back to that. I mean, the United States is a little different because it does seem to want to go back to that. It does seem to want to refight the 19th century Civil War, but that's a different question.
Yes, the Chinese leader that the United States recognized after the Civil War was Chiang Kai-shek, and he was just lauded in American media as he's just like George Washington, and these people want to be like Americans or like just like, which is completely fiction. And his critics called him "cash my check." Okay, because that's exactly what he did, is cash checks from the American taxpayer. He was a complete fraud, very, very corrupt, and nothing to do with democracy, just self-preservation and self-pleasure. I mean, he lived off the fat of the land of American taxpayers. So had nothing to do with democracy. And this has nothing to do with democracy either. This is an intentional way to increase tensions. Mike Pompeo can't wait to see you get through that door and slam it behind you.
All right. Well, we will be maintaining our focus on events in Asia and U.S.-Chinese relations. And remember, if you like The Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.